Miss Marple and the Poison in the Prayer Book, Chapter 1. The Hymn That Changed Everything. Village of Thornfield was precisely the sort of place where nothing of consequence ever happened. So everyone believed. The church, St. Matthias, stood at the heart of the high street with the patient dignity of 5 centuries, its flint walls weathered to a soft grey that matched the perpetually overcast English sky. The vicar, Reverend Edmund Blackwell, had presided over the parish for 23 years, conducting his services with the predictable rhythm of the liturgical calendar. Sunday mornings brought the same faces into the same pews, generation after generation. As reliable as the chiming of the church bells, Miss Jane Marple, now in her 78th year, occupied the pew third from the front on the right-hand side. She had held this position for nearly as long as the vicar himself, and the cushion beneath her knees bore the impression of decades of devotion. Her posture remained impeccably straight despite her years, and her pale blue eyes, magnified slightly behind her spectacles, noticed everything. They noticed the way young Thomas Hartley always positioned himself where he could observe Margaret Whitmore during the hymns. They noticed how Mrs. Patricia Vane's hands trembled slightly during the prayers, though her expression remained serene. They noticed the new brass candlestick near the altar, and how the light from the eastern window caught it at precisely 11:15 each. Sunday morning, on this particular Sunday in late September, the autumn light filtered through the stained glass in shades of amber and crimson. The congregation had settled into their familiar routine. Reverend Blackwell announced the opening. O God, our help in ages past, a favourite that brought a certain predictable comfort to the assembled worshippers. Hymnals were lifted, and voices rose in unison, somewhat thin and uncertain, as village congregations tend to sing. All might have continued in this peaceful manner had it not been for Mrs. Eleanor Hartley. She was a woman of 62, widow of the late Brigadier Hartley, a woman of considerable means and even more considerable opinions. She had lived in the old rectory on the edge of the village for 30 years, and despite her wealth, she was not particularly beloved. There was something brittle about her charm, something calculating in her generosity. She distributed her donations to the parish carefully, always with an eye toward recognition. The new prayer books had been her gift 3 years prior, and she had ensured that a brass plaque inside the cover bore her name in elegant italics. Mrs. Hartley stood in the second pew from the front, her voice rising above the others in the hymn. She wore her customary Sunday attire, a navy dress of quality wool, a string of pearls, and a small hat adorned with a single feather. Her prayer book, one of her own donated set, was held before her in hands that trembled slightly, though from age or emotion. No one could quite determine. Reverend Blackwell led the final verse with his customary precision. As the hymn concluded and the congregation settled into their seats, Mrs. Hartley remained standing for a moment longer than necessary. Those nearby and Miss Marple was nothing if not observant of such details, noticed that her breathing had become laboured. The feather in her hat quivered. "I feel quite unwell," Mrs. Hartley announced, her cultured voice cutting through the silence that followed the hymn. "The air in here is rather—" She did not complete the sentence. Her hand flew to her throat, her fingers clutching at the pearls as if they had suddenly tightened around her neck. The prayer book fell to the floor, pages fluttering open like a wounded bird. Mrs. Hartley's face, which moments before had been flushed with the exertion of singing, turned a mottled shade of grey-green. "Edmund," she gasped, reaching toward Reverend Blackwell with a hand that shook terribly. "Edmund, I cannot. The pain, the Reverend. a man more accustomed to the spiritual ailments of his parishioners than their physical ones, rose with an expression of confusion. Before he could reach her, Mrs. Hartley collapsed into her pew with a sound that was somehow both elegant and catastrophic. The rustle of expensive wool against worn wood, the soft thud of her small frame against the unyielding oak. For a moment, there was nothing but shocked silence. Then Mrs. Catherine Winters, who sat directly behind Mrs. Hartley and who had some experience as a nurse, moved with swift authority. She knelt beside the fallen woman, her capable hands checking for a pulse, her face growing grave as she conducted her examination. "Someone fetch Dr. Ashford," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of certainty. "And send for the police. I'm afraid Mrs. Hartley is dead." The statement hung in the air of St. Matthias like a profanity in a prayer book. Dead here in the church. During Sunday service, Miss Marple remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful rather than shocked. Her pale blue eyes followed the subsequent chaos with the interested attention of someone watching a particularly complex social dynamic unfold. The Reverend's flustered attempts to restore order, the quiet panic that began to ripple through the pews. Young Thomas Hartley, Mrs. Hartley's nephew, standing to get a better view before sinking back down with the realization that his and his benefactress, as many well knew, lay dead on the floor of the church, and there, on the stone flags near the pew, lay Mrs. Hartley's prayer book, its pages still open. Miss Marple observed that the book had fallen face down, which was somewhat fortunate, as it prevented the pages from being stained. She noticed, with the kind of small attention to detail that most people would overlook, that the spine of the book appeared to have something caught between its pages, a thin edge of something crystalline, perhaps, or perhaps merely the light striking the gilt edges in an unusual manner. She did not rise to inspect it more closely. That would come later, she suspected. For now, it was sufficient to observe, to listen, and to note the various reactions of those around her. The way Mrs. Patricia Vane gripped her hymnal until her knuckles whitened. The peculiar lack of surprise on the face of Dr. Ashford's wife when news came that her neighbour was indeed deceased. The speed with which Thomas Hartley calculated something on his fingers months, perhaps, or the timing of some inheritance. Miss Marple had spent 78 years studying human nature, learning that evil rarely announced itself with dramatic flair. It whispered, it calculated, it smiled over afternoon tea, and sometimes it hid between the pages of a prayer book. Chapter 2. The Village Speaks. By late afternoon, the news had spread through Thornfield with the efficiency of spilled ink, seeping into parchment. Mrs. Eleanor Hartley was dead deceased within the sanctified walls of St. Matthias Church, no less. The details, as they circulated, grew more elaborate with each telling. Miss Marple sat in her small parlour at Daisy Cottage, the afternoon light slanting through lace curtains, while her friend Mrs. Prudence Blackwell waited for the kettle to boil. Prudence was the Reverend's wife, a woman of 60 years with kind eyes and an unfortunate tendency toward nervous speech. She had arrived at Miss Marple's door within minutes of Dr. Ashford's departure from the church, her need to discuss the morning's events evidently outweighing her usual discretion. It was dreadful, Jane, Prudence said, accepting a cup of Earl Grey with trembling hands. Simply dreadful. One moment she was singing beautifully, I might add, though rather loudly, and the next, she simply collapsed, like a marionette whose strings have been cut. How distressing for everyone present, Miss Marple said mildly, settling herself in her chair with the ease of long practice. And for dear Reverend Blackwell, in particular, such an unfortunate occurrence in his church. Yes, Edmund is quite upset, though he's attempting to maintain his composure. Prudence lowered her voice, though there was no one to hear her but the cat. The police have taken the prayer book away, the one that fell from her hands. They seemed particularly interested in it, which I must confess struck me as odd. Why would they care about a prayer book? Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, though her fingers stilled around her teacup. Did they say why they found it of interest? Not a word. Inspector Hartwell, you know, the man from the county police, simply examined it carefully and placed it in a cloth bag. Most mysterious. But Jane, between you and me, I wonder if Eleanor simply had a heart attack. She was not a young woman, and she did have a habit of getting quite agitated about things. Just last week at the parish council meeting, she nearly had a fit about the new heating system in the vestry. Quite possible, Miss Marple agreed, though her eyes had taken on the distant quality of someone considering multiple possibilities simultaneously. Though I noticed she seemed rather well when she stood to sing. Her colour was good, and her breathing steady. Of course, one cannot always judge these matters from external appearances. Before Prudence could respond, a knock came at the cottage door. It was young Margaret Whitmore, the baker's daughter, her face flushed from hurrying. She was a girl of 23, pretty in a fair-haired, earnest way, and she had a habit of speaking before thinking, a tendency that often revealed more than she intended. Mrs. Blackwell, she said breathlessly, I've come to ask if you've heard the latest. My mother is convinced that Mrs. Hartley was murdered. Murdered. Prudence set down her teacup with a sharp clink. Margaret, what an extraordinary thing to say. Where on earth would you get such an idea? From Mrs. Winters, the nurse, Margaret said, sinking into the proffered chair. She was at the bakery this afternoon, and she said to my mother that Mrs. Hartley's symptoms didn't match a heart attack at all. She said the discoloration of her face and the way her hands clutched at her throat suggested poisoning. Poisoning, Mrs. Blackwell. In the church. The words hung in the air like a challenge to the afternoon's tranquility. Mrs. Winters is a competent woman, Miss Marple observed, but she is not a physician. I'm certain Dr. Ashford will conduct a proper examination and determine the exact cause of death. But wouldn't poisoning explain the interest in the prayer book? Margaret pressed on, her eyes bright with the sort of excitement that only the young can muster when confronted with genuine drama. What if someone poisoned her before the service? What if it was in the book itself, and that's why she died just as she was singing? Prudence made a small sound of distress. This is dreadful speculation, Margaret. Surely you shouldn't be spreading such thoughts about the village. I'm not spreading them, Margaret protested. Everyone's already talking about it. At the bakery, Mrs. Vane came in and said she'd never trusted Eleanor Hartley, that she was the sort of woman who made enemies easily. And then Thomas Hartley was at the post office, and he seemed almost relieved when he heard she'd died. That's what Mrs. Patterson said, anyway. Miss Marple refilled her teacup with deliberate slowness. Young Mr. Hartley has always seemed a pleasant enough youth. I imagine the shock of his aunt's sudden death may have affected his demeanor in ways he didn't intend. Perhaps, Margaret conceded, though her tone suggested doubt. But he was borrowing money from her, you know. Everyone knows that. His father lost it all in some business venture, and Mrs. Hartley was helping him financially. Surely that would provide a motive, if she were indeed murdered. My dear girl, Prudence said firmly, You're constructing elaborate theories on nothing but village gossip. We don't even know if there's been foul play." Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple noticed the way Prudence's hands had resumed their nervous fidgeting, the way her eyes darted toward the window as if seeking escape. Whatever assurances they offered one another, the seed had been planted. The comfortable certainty that Eleanor Hartley had simply succumbed to age or illness had been replaced by something far more unsettling. The possibility that death had come deliberately, administering its sentence through someone's deliberate action after Margaret had departed, satisfied with having delivered her news, and Prudence had excused herself to return to the vicarage. Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour. The light was fading now, casting long shadows across the room. She thought of Mrs. Hartley's trembling hands as she held the prayer book. She thought of the crystalline edge she had glimpsed between the pages. She thought of Mrs. Patricia Vane's whitened knuckles and young Thomas Hartley's careful calculation. Most importantly, she thought of the garden party at the Hartley house 3 weeks prior, when she had observed Eleanor in conversation with Margaret Whitmore's mother. There had been something cold in Eleanor's expression, something cruel in the way she'd dismissed the woman's request. A request for what, exactly? Miss Marple couldn't quite recall. But she remembered the look in Mrs. Whitmore's a look of desperate anger, quickly suppressed, and she thought of how many secrets a small village could hold, pressed between the pages of its ordinary life like flowers, pressed between the leaves of a prayer book. Tomorrow, perhaps, the police would provide answers, but Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it came, would be far more complicated than anyone in Thornfield was prepared to accept. Chapter 3. The inspector's visit. Inspector Geoffrey Hartwell arrived in Thornfield on Monday morning. A man of 55 with the methodical bearing of someone who had spent 30 years untangling human malfeasance. He was neither particularly tall nor particularly imposing, but there was something in his grey eyes that suggested he noticed things, though perhaps not quite as much as Miss Marple noticed. The preliminary autopsy report, conducted with admirable swiftness by the county coroner, had confirmed what Mrs. Winters had suspected. Eleanor Hartley had been poisoned. The substance was strychnine, a deadly alkaloid that produced precisely the symptoms that had been observed. The trembling hands, the spasms, the discoloration of the face, all consistent with strychnine poisoning. The question now was how the poison had been administered, and more pressingly, by whom. Inspector Hartwell had established himself at the village police station, a modest brick building near the post office, and had begun what he termed preliminary interviews with those present at the church service. He worked methodically through the list. Thomas Hartley, the nephew and primary heir, Reverend Edmund Blackwell, the vicar, Mrs. Catherine Winters, the nurse, and Margaret Whitmore, who had been present with her parents. Miss Marple encountered the inspector quite by accident on Tuesday morning, when she was visiting the post office to purchase stamps. He was standing near the counter, examining a small notebook with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. "Miss Marple," he said, looking up with the particular tone of voice that suggested he had been expecting to meet her. "I had hoped to have a word with you, as you were present at the service and your reputation for observation precedes you." Miss Marple adjusted her cardigan and offered a small, modest smile. "I'm afraid my observations are limited to the ordinary details of village life, Inspector. I doubt I could provide anything of significance." "Nevertheless," he said, gesturing toward a small interview room adjacent to the station proper, "I should like to hear your account." They settled into chairs across from a modest desk, and the inspector retrieved his notebook. The room smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and something else, perhaps the mustiness of accumulated bureaucratic files. "Tell me, Miss Marple," he began, "what was your impression of Mrs. Hartley in the moments before her collapse?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and considered the question with the gravity it deserved. She seemed in reasonable health and spirits. Her voice was strong during the hymn, perhaps somewhat louder than usual. But I confess I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she held the prayer book. I attributed it to age. Before or after the hymn concluded? Before, I should say. I remember thinking it was the exertion of singing, though now I wonder if it might have indicated something else. The inspector made a notation. And the prayer book itself, did you observe anything unusual about it? Here, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of careful consideration. It appeared to be one of the books Mrs. Hartley donated to the church some years ago. When she collapsed, the book fell. I noticed that something appeared to be caught between the pages, something crystalline perhaps, though it may have been merely the light catching the gilt edges. Inspector Hartwell's pen paused mid. You observed that the book contained something unusual. I observed that something appeared unusual about it, Miss Marple corrected gently. Whether that appearance corresponds to anything of actual significance, I cannot say. I am merely reporting what my eyes seemed to convey. The inspector returned to his writing. And what of the other parishioners? Did you notice anything remarkable about their behavior or reactions? Young Mr. Hartley seemed somewhat distressed, though that is hardly surprising given the circumstances. Mrs. Patricia Vane appeared anxious before the service even concluded. Her hands were quite white as she gripped her hymnal. And Mrs. Winters, the nurse, seemed unsurprised by Mrs. Hartley's collapse, as if she had perhaps expected something of the sort, though I may be reading too much into the expression on her face. You notice a great deal, the inspector observed. One observes village life for many years, Inspector, and patterns emerge. People reveal themselves through small gestures and reactions. It's rather like reading the text of a book. The meaning lies not merely in the words, but in the spaces between them. Inspector Hartwell set down his pen and regarded her with what appeared to be genuine interest. And what does the text of this particular situation reveal to you, Miss Marple? Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. That Mrs. Eleanor Hartley was not a woman who was universally beloved. That there are several individuals in this village who might have harbored grievances against her. And that whoever administered the poison did so with considerable knowledge and planning. For to place strychnine where it would dissolve in a prayer book and be absorbed through the skin requires both intelligence and access. The inspector leaned forward slightly. Access to the prayer book before the service. Access to knowledge of poisons. Access to Mrs. Hartley's habits and routines. These are not casual matters, Inspector. Indeed, they are not. He stood, and Miss Marple understood that the interview was concluded. You've been most helpful, Miss Marple. Should you recall any other details, I trust you'll contact me immediately. Over the following days, Miss Marple observed the village with renewed attention. She noted that young Thomas Hartley had begun visiting the solicitor's office with increasing frequency, no doubt regarding the disposition of his aunt's considerable estate. She observed that Mrs. Patricia Vane had taken to walking past her cottage at unusual hours, her expression troubled, and she noticed that Margaret Whitmore's mother, Mrs. Sarah Whitmore, had suddenly grown quieter, less inclined to speak at the market, as if some internal struggle occupied her thoughts. Most intriguingly, she received a visitor on Thursday afternoon, Reverend Blackwell himself, who arrived looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Jane," he said, accepting the offered tea with visible reluctance, "I find myself in a rather delicate position. The inspector has been asking questions about Eleanor's recent behavior, particularly regarding parish matters. I'm afraid some of my answers may have placed certain people in an awkward light." "I'm sure you answered truthfully," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes, but truth can be dreadfully inconvenient, can't it?" The Reverend set down his cup with a clink. Eleanor had recently discovered something a discrepancy in the parish accounts. She was threatening to bring it to the police unless the matter was resolved discreetly. "Now, I'm terrified that someone thought Eleanor's death was the solution to their problem." Miss Marple's eyes, behind their spectacles, grew very still. "A discrepancy in the accounts. I shouldn't be telling you this," the Reverend said miserably. "But I know you for a woman of discretion, and I thought perhaps, well, I thought you might understand the implications better than I do." After the Reverend had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour as the afternoon light began to fade. The pattern was becoming clearer now, like a tapestry viewed from the back, where one could begin to discern the design, even if not every thread was yet visible. Someone in Thornfield had poisoned Eleanor Hartley, not merely out of personal spite, but out of desperation. And that desperation, Miss Marple suspected, was tied to secrets far more substantial than anyone yet realized. The question now was which secret, and whose desperation had proven deadly. Chapter 4. The obvious suspect by Friday of that week. Inspector Hartwell had settled upon what appeared to be an entirely reasonable conclusion. The evidence, as he laid it out during a meeting with the village constable and several representatives from the parish council, was quite compelling. Thomas Hartley stood to inherit approximately £40,000 from his aunt's estate, substantial sum that would resolve his considerable financial difficulties. He had been present at the church service. He had been observed accepting delivery of a parcel at his lodgings on the previous Tuesday, a parcel that bore markings suggesting it had come from London. Most damning of all, when the inspector's men had conducted a discreet search of Thomas's rooms, they had discovered a book on pharmacology and chemistry tucked beneath his mattress, with several pages marked and annotated regarding the properties of various poisons. The inference was clear. Thomas had ordered strychnine from a supplier in London, had studied its properties, and had administered it to his aunt through the prayer book, presumably by coating the gilt edges or the binding with the dissolved substance. Mrs. Hartley, with her habit of handling the book during the service, would have absorbed a lethal dose through the delicate skin of her hands. Inspector Hartwell seemed satisfied with this deduction. He issued instructions for Thomas Hartley's arrest, which took place on Saturday morning at the post office, where Thomas had been conducting some errand. The young man's protestations of innocence were duly noted and dismissed as the predictable responses of a guilty party. Thornfield, relieved that the murderer had been apprehended, began the slow process of returning to normal. The scandal was contained, the danger past. The vicar preached a sermon on forgiveness. The ladies' auxiliary discussed plans for the autumn flower festival. Life, it seemed, would resume its ordinary rhythms. Miss Marple, however, was not satisfied. She sat in her parlour on Saturday afternoon, having declined an invitation to attend the impromptu tea that Mrs. Blackwell was hosting to discuss the arrest. Instead, she had occupied herself with reading through old copies of the village newsletter, a somewhat poorly produced but diligent record of local events maintained by Mr. Aberline. The schoolmaster, what she was searching for, she was not entirely certain. Some inconsistency, some detail that did not quite align with the narrative the inspector had constructed. She found it, eventually. In an issue from 3 months prior, there had been a brief notice about the parish council meeting held in June. Among the items discussed, a grant application for repairs to the church roof, approved by the council and signed by both Reverend Blackwell and Eleanor Hartley, who served as the council's treasurer. The amount approved was £800. The notice in the July newsletter, however, mentioned that the actual repair work had cost only £560, a discrepancy of £240, a tidy sum, particularly for a village where most people earned considerably less. Miss Marple made a note in her small leather notebook and continued reading in August's newsletter. There had been another repair project, work to the church's heating system, again approved for a considerable sum. And again, in September's issue, the actual cost appeared to be substantially less than the budgeted amount. She rose from her chair and, putting on her hat and coat, made her way to the vicarage. It was near tea time, and she suspected Reverend Blackwell would be available for a brief conversation. Prudence answered the door and, upon seeing Miss Marple's expression, seemed to understand that this was not a social visit. She ushered her friend into the study, where Edmund was reviewing his sermon notes. "Jane," he said, setting aside his papers, "this is an unexpected pleasure. I trust you're not here to persuade me that young Thomas is innocent. The evidence against him seems quite conclusive." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said, settling herself without waiting for an invitation. "I am here to inquire about the parish finances." The Reverend's face went very still. The parish finances. Specifically, the discrepancies between the budgeted amounts and the actual costs for the recent repairs. The roof work in June and the heating system in August. "Jane," Reverend Blackwell began, but Miss Marple raised a hand. "I am not here in any official capacity, Edmund. I am merely an old woman with a habit of noticing things. However, I would very much like to know whether Eleanor discovered these discrepancies, or whether they are merely administrative oversights that I have misinterpreted." The Reverend stood and walked to the window, his shoulders bent as if under an invisible weight. "Eleanor discovered them," he said quietly. 3 weeks ago, she reviewed the accounts as part of her duties as treasurer and noticed the discrepancies immediately. She was planning to bring them to the inspector unless the matter was resolved. And who was responsible for these discrepancies, Edmund? The silence that followed was answer enough. "Good heavens," Miss Marple said softly. "It was you, not deliberately," the Reverend said, turning back to face her. His face was anguished. "Jane, you must understand my son, Michael. He's had difficulties. Nothing serious, nothing criminal. But he required money. Help. Eleanor had agreed to lend him £500 from her personal funds. But when she discovered the missing money from the parish accounts, she became convinced that I had taken it for him. She was going to expose everything unless I admitted to the theft and repaid the full amount immediately, which you could not do, which I could not do. And so I was desperate, Jane. Desperate enough to..." He stopped. Realizing the implications of what he had been about to say, Miss Marple's expression remained perfectly calm, though her eyes had sharpened behind her spectacles. "Desperate enough to kill her? No." The word came out with genuine anguish. "No, Jane, I swear to you, I had no hand in Eleanor's death. Yes, I was terrified of exposure, of losing my position, of bringing scandal to the parish. But I could never commit murder." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "Then who did?" Edmund? And why does Inspector Hartwell believe it was Thomas? The Reverend returned to his chair, looking suddenly old and exhausted. I don't know, Jane. Thomas is innocent, certain of it. But the evidence against him is damning, and I lack the courage to come forward with the truth about Eleanor's discovery and the parish accounts. If I do, I implicate myself in a motive for murder, even though I am guilty of nothing but financial mismanagement and cowardice. Miss Marple rose to her feet. Then I suggest, Edmund, that you find your courage rather quickly, because an innocent young man is about to be tried for a crime he did not commit, and the real murderer remains at liberty in this village, watching and waiting to see whether their deception will hold. She left the vicarage in the gathering dusk, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. The inspector had constructed a case against Thomas that, while circumstantial, was sufficiently compelling to convince a court, but it was built upon assumptions rather than truth. And somewhere in Thornfield, someone who had been watching Eleanor Hartley's activities with desperate attention had decided that her death was the only solution to their predicament. The question was, who among them had possessed both the knowledge and the motive to administer strychnine through a prayer book? And why had they so conveniently allowed Thomas Hartley to become the obvious suspect? Chapter 5. The Garden Party Remembered. Monday morning, Miss Marple attended the preliminary hearing in which Thomas Hartley was formally charged with the murder of Eleanor Hartley. The courthouse, a grey stone building in the neighbouring town of Ashford, was filled with the curious and the concerned. Thornfield had turned out in considerable numbers, eager to witness the drama of a murder trial. Even in its earliest stages, Thomas stood in the dock, pale but composed, maintaining his insistence upon innocence with the sort of quiet dignity that made Miss Marple's heart ache. The evidence, as presented by Inspector Hartwell, was devastating. The pharmacology book, the London parcel, the financial motive, the constable's testimony that Thomas had been observed near the church an hour before the service, ostensibly adjusting the hymn boards, though no one could recall exactly when this adjustment had been made or what adjustment was required. It was this last detail that troubled Miss Marple most profoundly, not because it implicated Thomas. She was already convinced of his innocence, but because it suggested that someone had deliberately placed him near the prayer books with time to administer the poison. Someone had arranged the pieces of evidence with careful deliberation. After the hearing concluded, Miss Marple did not return directly to Thornfield. Instead, she made her way to the town library, where she requested access to the newspaper archives from the past 3 months. The librarian, a young woman with a remarkably helpful disposition, provided her with bound copies of the county papers. Miss Marple spent the better part of the afternoon reading through society notices and local news, her pale blue eyes tracking with methodical precision through announcements of births, deaths, engagements, and social events. It was there, buried in the July edition of the Ashford Gazette, that she found what she was seeking. A notice announced that Mrs. Eleanor Hartley had hosted a garden party on the 16th of July, welcoming the wives of prominent village citizens and county officials. Among those listed as attending was Mrs. Sarah Whitmore, wife of the baker, Mrs. Patricia Vane, widow, and Miss Margaret Whitmore. Also listed, somewhat incongruously, was Dr. William Vane, recently returned from medical practice in India. Miss Marple's fingers stilled on the page. Dr. William Vane. She had not heard this name mentioned once during all the subsequent investigations and discussions. Indeed, she had not known that Mrs. Patricia Vane had a son, Yet here was evidence that a doctored someone with knowledge of poisons, their properties, and their administration had been in Thornfield in July. She borrowed a pencil from the librarian and made a careful notation in her small leather book, then returned the newspapers and made her way to the railway station. By the time Miss Marple arrived back at Daisy Cottage, the sun was sinking toward the western hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She settled herself with a pot of tea and a address book, a well-worn volume that contained the contact information of various individuals she had accumulated over many years of village life and correspondence. There was a Dr. Ashford in Thornfield, of course, who had conducted the preliminary examination of Eleanor Hartley's body. But what Miss Marple needed was information about Mrs. Patricia Vane's son, who had apparently returned from India around the time of Eleanor's murder. She wrote a letter to her cousin, Eleanor Vane, who lived in Hampshire and maintained extensive social connections throughout the county. The letter was brief and seemingly casual, inquiring about Mrs. Patricia Vane and mentioning that Miss Marple had heard through the grapevine that Mrs. Vane had a son practicing medicine abroad. Would Eleanor know anything about this young man? Had he perhaps returned to England recently? The reply came by post 3 days later. Eleanor's handwriting was characteristically precise. Yes, she had heard that Dr. William Vane had returned from India quite suddenly in June, ostensibly due to health concerns, though the nature of these concerns had never been entirely clear. He was reportedly staying with his mother in Thornfield, though apparently there was some tension between them. Eleanor had heard through mutual acquaintances that William Vane had been involved in some sort of scandal in India. Nothing criminal, but something that had damaged his professional reputation and necessitated a hasty return to England. Most intriguingly, Eleanor mentioned that William Vane had acquired his medical degree with a specialty in pharmacology. He had been expected to make his fortune in India treating the various ailments of the British colonial population. But something had gone terribly wrong. Miss Marple set down the letter and looked out her window into the gathering darkness. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though not yet the complete picture. A man with knowledge of poisons, a man who had been in Thornfield during the critical period, a man with apparent reason to be angry or desperate, and a mother, Mrs. Patricia Vane, with her whitened knuckles and her anxious demeanor on the morning of Eleanor's death. The following morning, Miss Marple requested an interview with Inspector Hartwell. The inspector, somewhat irritated at having his investigation questioned by an elderly spinster, nevertheless agreed to meet her at the village police station. "Miss Marple," he said, not bothering to rise from his desk, "I trust you're not here to tell me that young Hartley is innocent. The evidence against him is conclusive, and the case will go to trial next month." "On the contrary, Inspector," Miss Marple said, settling herself in the chair opposite his desk, "I am here to ask you a rather simple question. During your investigation, did you inquire into the movements of Dr. William Vane?" The inspector's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. Dr. William Vane, Mrs. Patricia Vane's son, a man with medical training and specific knowledge of pharmacology, a man who returned to Thornfield in June from India, ostensibly due to health concerns, a man who was present at Eleanor Hartley's garden party in July, the very event at which, I suspect, Eleanor made some discovery or comment that proved problematic for him. Inspector Hartwell set down his pen with deliberate slowness. "Mrs. Vane has a son, yes, but he was not in Thornfield when Eleanor Hartley was murdered. He had already returned to London to secure a new position." How do you know this? Miss Marple asked quietly. Because I asked Mrs. Vane directly, and she told me so, and you believed her without verification. The inspector's jaw tightened. His mother is a respectable widow. There was no reason to suspect. There was every reason to suspect, Miss Marple interrupted gently. If one had noticed that Mrs. Vane's hands trembled during the church service, and that she has continued to tremble anxiously throughout this investigation. A woman protecting her son does not display the calm of innocent ignorance, Inspector. She displays the anxiety of profound knowledge and fear. These are mere speculations, Miss Marple. I have an arrest and mounting evidence. I cannot pursue every wild theory that occurs to. Then let me ask you this, Miss Marple said, leaning forward slightly. When you examined the prayer book, did you verify the source of the strychnine? Did you determine how it was applied through the binding, the gilt edges, or some other method? And did you establish the precise timeline of when the poison was applied? The inspector's silence was sufficiently eloquent. You did not, Miss Marple said softly. You found circumstantial evidence pointing to Thomas Hartley and constructed a narrative to fit that evidence. You did not ask whether that narrative was the only possible explanation for what occurred in St. Matthias Church on Sunday morning. She rose to her feet and gathered her handbag. I suggest, Inspector, that you make discreet inquiries regarding Dr. William Vane's precise location on the morning of Eleanor Hartley's death. And I suggest you do so with some urgency, for an innocent young man's life may depend upon the accuracy of your investigation. She left the station without waiting for a response, her mind working through the implications of what she had learned. William Vane had knowledge of poisons. His mother had trembling hands and anxious eyes. Eleanor Hartley had apparently discovered something at the garden party that troubled her. But what had Eleanor discovered? And what hold did that discovery have over Dr. William Vane that it would drive him to murder? Chapter 6. Secrets in the Drawing Room. Inspector Hartwell's inquiries regarding Dr. William Vane's whereabouts proved less conclusive than Miss Marple had hoped. The inspector discovered that William had indeed claimed to be in London on the morning of Eleanor Hartley's death, but his alibi, a meeting with a prospective employer at 9 o'clock in the morning, could not be verified. The prospective employer had been out of town. William had simply appeared at the offices, left a calling card, and departed. Whether he had actually been in London or in Thornfield remained, frustratingly, a matter of conjecture. It was this uncertainty that prompted Miss Marple to take a more direct approach. On Thursday afternoon, she made her way to the Vane residence, a modest but respectable house near the village square, and requested an audience with Mrs. Patricia Vane. The widow received her in the drawing room, a space decorated in the faded elegance of genteel poverty. The furniture was good, but worn, the wallpaper slightly dated. Mrs. Vane herself appeared diminished since last Sunday, more drawn, as if the events of the past week had consumed her from within. Miss Marple, Mrs. Vane said, attempting a smile that did not reach her eyes. This is an unexpected visit. I trust you're not here to discuss young Mr. Hartley. Such a dreadful business, though I suppose the evidence against him is quite substantial. I have not come to discuss Mr. Hartley, Miss Marple said, settling herself without invitation. I have come to discuss your son, William. I understand he has recently returned from India. Mrs. Vane's hands, which had been folded in her lap, began to tremble. My son, yes, he returned several months ago. He's secured a position in London, which is keeping him quite occupied. How fortunate, Miss Marple said mildly. And what was the nature of the scandal that necessitated his hasty departure from India? The colour drained from Mrs. Vane's face. I don't know what you're referring to. I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. Your cousin Eleanor mentioned it in her correspondence. A scandal of sufficient severity to damage his professional reputation and force him to abandon what was to have been a lucrative position. What occurred in India, Mrs. Vane? Mrs. Vane rose abruptly and walked to the window, her back to Miss Marple. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. William made an error of judgment. A woman died under circumstances that were a patient, a British woman of considerable social standing. She had been suffering from a nervous condition, and William was treating her with a new compound he had developed. She died, and an inquiry was opened. Though William was ultimately exonerated, the scandal damaged his reputation beyond repair. He had no choice but to return to England, and Eleanor Hartley knew of this. I don't know how she knew, Mrs. Vane whispered, but at the garden party, she said something to me, in that cruel way of hers, about questionable medical practices and deaths that were not quite accidental. She was always so vicious. Miss Marple, always probing, always spreading rumours. When I told William what she had said, he was devastated. He said his position in London was not secure, that if Eleanor spread such talk, he would lose everything he had worked to rebuild. And what did you tell him? Miss Marple asked softly. I told him nothing. I assured him that Eleanor was merely being spiteful, that no one would believe her gossip. Mrs. Vane turned, and her eyes were wet with tears. But if you've discovered the truth about William's past, what will you do with that information? Before Miss Marple could respond, the drawing-room door opened. A young man entered, not William, but Thomas Hartley's father, Mr. Charles Hartley. A gentleman of some 60 years, with grey whiskers and a troubled expression. Patricia, he said, then stopped upon seeing Miss Marple. I apologize for the intrusion. I didn't realize you had a visitor. Mr. Hartley, Miss Marple said, her interest piqued. How unusual to find you visiting Mrs. Vane at this hour. Charles Hartley's face flushed crimson. That is, Mrs. Vane and I have known each other for many years. We were just discussing the dreadful situation with my son. Were you indeed? Miss Marple said. How interesting. And did you know, Mr. Hartley, about the financial discrepancies in the parish accounts? The missing £240 that Eleanor Hartley discovered. The silence that followed was deafening. I thought not, Miss Marple continued. I suspect that it was not Reverend Blackwell who took the money, but rather someone far closer to the Hartley family. Someone who understood that Thomas would become the convenient suspect should Eleanor's death be required to cover up the theft. Mrs. Vane made a small sound of distress. Miss Marple, you cannot possibly suggest what I suggest, Mrs. Vane, is that the relationships in this village are far more complicated than they initially appear. That Charles Hartley, who stands to inherit nothing from Eleanor's death, but whose son stands to inherit considerably, was in desperate financial straits. That he may have stolen from the parish accounts and relied upon Thomas's future inheritance to cover the theft before Eleanor discovered his involvement. That's preposterous, Charles Hartley said. But his voice lacked conviction. Is it? Miss Marple asked. Then explain your presence here at Mrs. Vane's residence at this particular moment. Explain the nature of your long friendship with a woman whose son has recently returned from scandal and disgrace. Charles Hartley sat down heavily in one of the drawing-room chairs. Eleanor was blackmailing me, he said finally, his voice hollow. She discovered the missing funds and suspected that I had taken them. She threatened to bring the matter to the police unless I made restitution and confessed my incompetence to the parish council. I didn't know how to tell Thomas. I couldn't bear the shame. And did you come to Mrs. Vane seeking sympathy? Miss Marple asked. Yes, Mrs. Vane said quietly. Charles came to me distressed, and I offered what comfort I could. We had been close once, years ago, before I married Reginald. But that was all, Miss Marple. There was nothing improper. I'm not suggesting there was, Miss Marple said, though she was beginning to see the outline of yet another complication. What I am suggesting is that both you and Mr. Hartley had reason to wish Eleanor Hartley dead, and that either of you might have known that someone else, someone with access to poisons, might accomplish that task. Are you suggesting, Mrs. Vane said coldly, that I would harm Eleanor to protect my son from having to answer questions about his past? I am suggesting nothing, Miss Marple said, rising to her feet. I am merely observing that in this village there are far more secrets than there are innocent people, and that many of those secrets lead back to Eleanor Hartley's manipulation and cruelty. She made her way to the door, then paused. One final question, Mrs. Vane. On the morning of Eleanor's death, did your son remain in London, or did he return to Thornfield? Mrs. Vane's face was a study in anguish. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know where he was, as Miss Marple walked back to Daisy Cottage, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the village green. She felt no satisfaction at having uncovered these tangled secrets. If anything, she felt a deepening sense of dread. For the more she learned, the more apparent it became that Eleanor Hartley had been entangled in the private lives of nearly everyone in Thornfield, blackmailing some, threatening others, spreading rumors with calculated cruelty. The question was no longer who had the motive to kill her. The question was why it had taken so long. And more pressingly, was Thomas Hartley truly guilty, or was he merely the most convenient sacrifice in a village of secrets? Chapter 7. The Second Death. The letter arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on Friday morning, bearing a London postmark and William Vane's careful handwriting. It was brief and remarkably direct. Miss Marple, it read, My mother has informed me of your recent inquiries. I wish to clarify matters regarding my whereabouts on the morning of Eleanor Hartley's death. I was indeed in Thornfield, having returned on the night train. I came to speak with Mrs. Hartley regarding her intentions to spread rumors about my past. I did not kill her, but I confess I was present near the church that morning. Given the circumstances, I believe it in my best interest to remain in London until this matter is resolved. I trust you will exercise discretion regarding this information. Yours, William Vane. Miss Marple read the letter 3 times, her expression growing increasingly troubled. William Vane was confessing to being in Thornfield on the morning of the murder, an admission that effectively removed him from the protection of his false alibi. Yet he maintained his innocence regarding Eleanor's death. The question was whether such an admission was a sign of honest desperation or a calculated move to control the narrative before someone else exposed his presence. She was still considering this dilemma when Constable Parker arrived at her door with news that sent a chill through the quiet afternoon. Mrs. Patricia Vane had been found dead in her home that morning. The constable's account was confused and alarmed. Mrs. Vane had apparently taken an overdose of her heart medication, a substantial quantity, according to the preliminary assessment. Whether it was accident or suicide remained to be determined, though the constable's tone suggested that suicide was the more likely conclusion. Miss Marple sat very still, her hands folded in her lap. When was she discovered? This morning, at 8:30, when her housemaid arrived to prepare breakfast, the medication bottle was found on the bedside table, quite empty. She had left no note, but given the circumstances, the stress of her son's situation, the questions about her knowledge of events, many believe she simply couldn't bear the pressure. After the constable had departed, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of genuine distress. Whether Patricia Vane had taken her own life or had been persuaded to do so, her death represented a catastrophic loss of information. The one person who might have definitively confirmed William's alibi, lack thereof, was now beyond the reach of interrogation. She dressed quickly and made her way to the police station, where she found Inspector Hartwell reviewing the preliminary medical report with visible frustration. "Another death," she said, without preamble, "and this one is far more suspicious than it initially appears." The inspector looked up, irritation evident in his expression. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Vane's death, while tragic, appears straightforward. A woman under considerable stress, taking medication for a chronic heart condition. A woman taking precisely the amount of medication necessary to cause death." Miss Marple interrupted. "Tell me, Inspector, was the medication bottle examined for fingerprints?" "Of course not. It's her own medication, prescribed by her own physician. And did you examine the location of the bottle relative to her body? Did you note whether it was positioned where a woman lying in bed could naturally have reached it, or whether it sat at an unusual distance?" The inspector's jaw tightened. "You're suggesting murder." "I'm suggesting that the convenient nature of Mrs. Vane's death, arriving at the precise moment when she was about to be questioned further regarding her son's movements, is worth investigating with greater care than you have thus far employed." Inspector Hartwell stood abruptly. "I have a murder trial preparing to commence in 3 weeks. I have an arrest, substantial circumstantial evidence, and a case that will almost certainly result in conviction. I do not have the luxury of pursuing every wild speculation that occurs to an elderly woman with a taste for detecting." "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "you have the far greater responsibility of ensuring that an innocent person is not hanged for a crime they did not commit. But if you will not pursue this matter, I will." She left the police station and made her way directly to the Vane residence, where she found that Mrs. Vane's effects were already being catalogued by her solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, a thin man of advancing years who seemed surprised to find Miss Marple at the door. "I have been entrusted with the inventory of Mrs. Vane's estate," he explained, when Miss Marple requested access to the bedroom. "Her son is the sole heir." "Then I'm certain Mr. Vane would wish for a thorough investigation into the circumstances of his mother's death," Miss Marple said with perfect courtesy. "I am acting at the request of Inspector Hartwell to verify certain details regarding the timeline of Mrs. Vane's final hours." The lie was small and smooth, and Mr. Pemberton accepted it without question. The bedroom was neat and orderly, the bed precisely made except for the impression where Patricia had lain. The medication bottle sat on the bedside table, indeed quite empty, and positioned at a distance that would have required Patricia to sit up and reach across a span of several inches. The glass of water beside it was also empty. Rinsed clean, Miss Marple examined the bottle carefully, noting the doctor's label, 1 tablet each evening for cardiac distress. "How many tablets were in the original prescription?" she asked Mr. Pemberton. "I'm afraid I don't know, Miss Marple. The bottle has been empty for some time." Apparently, but Miss Marple had already noted something far more significant. The prescription label bore a date from 3 weeks prior, precisely the time that Eleanor Hartley had died. Patricia had been taking the medication regularly for that duration. which meant she would have had perhaps a dozen tablets remaining. Not the quantity necessary to cause a fatal overdose, unless, of course, someone had acquired additional tablets and refilled the bottle without the doctor's knowledge. She left the bedroom and descended the stairs, her mind working through the implications. Someone in Thornfield had not only poisoned Eleanor Hartley, but had now silenced the one person most likely to expose the truth about that poisoning. Someone who understood the village well enough to know which secrets would drive which people to desperation. Someone for whom Eleanor's death was not merely an act of self-preservation, but potentially an act of mercy or revenge. On her walk home, Miss Marple passed the church where the Sunday service would be conducted that evening. She paused outside the heavy oak doors, looking at the building where Eleanor had died. Somewhere within this village, she thought, was a person capable of remarkable cold calculation. Someone who had studied the relationships and resentments of Thornfield, with the sort of patient observation that Miss Marple herself practiced. Someone who understood that Eleanor's death, when properly managed, could be made to serve multiple purposes at once, eliminating a threat, allowing the guilty to feel temporarily relieved, and conveniently focusing suspicion on a convenient scapegoat. And now, with Patricia Vane's death, that person had raised the stakes considerably. If the death could be made to appear suicidal, it would serve as apparent confirmation of guilt regarding Eleanor, as if Patricia, unable to bear the knowledge of her son's crime, had taken her own life in despair. But Miss Marple knew better. Patricia Vane had not killed herself, and that knowledge meant that somewhere in Thornfield, a murderer was walking free, watching and waiting to see whether their deception would hold against increasing scrutiny. The question was no longer merely who had killed Eleanor Hartley. The question was, who possessed the capacity to commit two murders in the span of a single week? Chapter 8. The Test of Conscience. On Saturday afternoon, Miss Marple sent invitations to tea to 3 individuals whose involvement in the affair remained ambiguous: Reverend Edmund Blackwell, Margaret Whitmore, and Charles Hartley. The invitations were couched in the gentlest terms: a small gathering to discuss community matters of concern, but each recipient understood, on some level, that Miss Marple had summoned them for a specific purpose. They arrived at staggered intervals, and Miss Marple received them one at a time in her parlour, where the afternoon light cast everything in soft, almost confessional tones. Each conversation was brief, ostensibly casual, yet carefully constructed to achieve a single objective: to observe how each individual reacted when confronted with certain information. To Reverend Blackwell, she said, "I have been thinking about the parish accounts, Edmund, and I wonder if you might have considered the possibility that the discrepancies were not the result of human error or deliberate theft, but rather manipulation by someone seeking to implicate you in wrongdoing. Have you considered that Eleanor might have been ensuring you appeared guilty should the accounts be reviewed?" The Reverend's face went pale. Good heavens! I had not, but why would Eleanor do such a thing? To maintain control, perhaps, Miss Marple suggested. If you appeared guilty of theft, you would be entirely dependent upon her discretion regarding whether to expose you. She would have leverage over your actions and decisions. It's a rather clever form of blackmail, don't you think? The Reverend made no response, but Miss Marple noted that his hands trembled as he accepted his teacup. To Margaret Whitmore, she posed a different question. "Tell me, my dear, did Eleanor ever speak to you about your mother's request, the one she refused at the garden party?" Margaret's fair complexion flushed crimson. "How did you know?" She never mentioned it directly. But my mother has been quite troubled ever since that day. Miss Marple, I've never understood what Mrs. Hartley said to her that caused such distress. Perhaps your mother was seeking financial assistance, Miss Marple suggested, and Eleanor refused in such a manner as to humiliate her. Your mother is a proud woman, Margaret. A public refusal would have wounded her deeply. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. My mother has always been so strong. To think of her being treated that way by someone like Eleanor. When Charles Hartley arrived, Miss Marple greeted him with particular warmth and invited him to sit. Mr. Hartley, I have been wondering about something. When Eleanor discovered the missing parish funds, did she actually accuse you of the theft, or did she merely imply it? Charles shifted uncomfortably. She implied it. She never actually stated that she believed I had taken the money, but her questions were pointed, her tone accusatory. She made it clear that she would report the discrepancies, unless I could explain them satisfactorily. And could you? Miss Marple asked gently. No, Charles admitted. I couldn't. The money was simply gone, and I had no explanation for its disappearance. I was terrified. As each guest departed, Miss Marple did not reveal the true purpose of her questions, but she observed everything. The trembling of hands, the catch in voices, the particular way fear manifested in each individual. It was only later that afternoon, as she sat alone in her parlor reviewing the conversations, that a detail emerged from the depths of her memory. Something Margaret had said, or rather, something Margaret had not said. Despite being asked a direct question, Margaret had never clarified what her mother's request had been. Miss Marple rose and went to her desk, where she kept the carefully organized records of village affairs that she had accumulated over many decades. She found the note she had made during the garden party season, a brief mention that Mrs. Whitmore had been observed in conversation with Eleanor, and that the conversation had ended with Margaret's mother appearing distressed. But what had the request been? She was still considering this when a knock came at her door. It was young Margaret herself, her face streaked with tears, her composure entirely abandoned. Miss Marple, she said breathlessly. Without waiting for an invitation to enter, I need to tell you something. About my mother. About what Eleanor said to her at the garden party. Miss Marple ushered the girl inside and offered her a seat, along with a fresh pot of tea. Margaret accepted both with visible gratitude, as if the simple act of being received with kindness had broken through whatever barrier had been restraining her. My mother was asking Eleanor for a small loan, Margaret began. Nothing substantial, merely £300. You see, our baker's business has been struggling, and there were debts that needed to be paid. Eleanor was wealthy, and my mother thought perhaps she might be willing to help another villager in need, and Eleanor refused. Miss Marple prompted gently. Not merely refused, Margaret said, her voice breaking. She laughed. She actually laughed at my mother and told her that someone of our station should know better than to appeal to their betters for charity. She said that if my mother lacked the business acumen to maintain her own enterprise, that was hardly Eleanor's concern. And then Eleanor said something truly cruel. She said that perhaps the village would be better served if the bakery simply closed, as my mother's inferior product was drawing customers away from the proper confectioners in the neighboring towns. Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. And your mother heard all of this? Yes, and there were other people present, Mrs. Vane, and several of Eleanor's society friends. She humiliated my mother publicly, deliberately, and with malice. My mother hasn't been the same since. She barely leaves the house. She's been so depressed that I've feared for her safety. After Margaret had departed, somewhat comforted by the knowledge that her confidence had been received with compassion, Miss Marple sat very still in her darkening parlour. The pattern was becoming clear now, devastatingly, irrevocably clear. Eleanor Hartley had not merely been a cruel woman. She had been a woman who derived genuine pleasure from the suffering of others. She had blackmailed the Reverend, humiliated Mrs. Whitmore, threatened William Vane's reputation, and manipulated Charles Hartley with the calculated intelligence of someone who understood human weakness. And in doing all of this, she had made herself a target for someone whose pain had been transformed into action. Someone who had watched Eleanor Hartley with the same careful observation that Miss Marple herself employed. Someone who had calculated that Eleanor's death would serve not merely as self-preservation, but as a kind of justice, removing a predatory woman who took pleasure in causing suffering. But that person was also a murderer, and they had compounded that crime by attempting to frame an innocent young man. The question now was, which of the three people Miss Marple had spoken to that afternoon was capable of such calculated cruelty? Which of them possessed the knowledge and the opportunity to administer strychnine through a prayer book? And which of them had the nerve to murder Patricia Vane when she became a threat to their deception? Miss Marple rose and walked to her writing desk. She had one final test to conduct, one final observation to make, and when it was done, she would know with certainty who had poisoned Eleanor Hartley in the church of St. Matthias. Chapter 9. The revelation. Miss Marple sent a single letter to Inspector Hartwell on Sunday morning. It was brief but commanding. Inspector, I have determined the identity of Eleanor Hartley's murderer. I request that you meet me at St. Matthias Church at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and that you bring Reverend Edmund Blackwell and Margaret Whitmore as well. I believe you will find what I have to show you highly illuminating. At precisely 2 o'clock, the four of them stood in the quiet sanctuary of the church. The autumn sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting coloured shadows across the stone floor. Miss Marple stood near the second pew from the front, the pew where Eleanor Hartley had collapsed, and gestured for the others to gather around her. Inspector, she began, you have constructed a case against young Thomas Hartley based on circumstantial evidence, the pharmacology book, the London parcel, his financial motive, and his presence near the church on the morning of the murder. All of these things are true, but they are not proof of guilt. They are, in fact, the carefully arranged evidence of someone who understood your investigative methods well enough to provide you with exactly what you would expect to find. Miss Marple, Inspector Hartwell began. I don't see the point of the prayer book, Miss Marple continued, as if he had not spoken. You found it at the scene, its pages open, something crystalline visible between the pages. You concluded that strychnine had been applied to the book's binding or gilt edges, and that Mrs. Hartley absorbed it through her hands. But what if the poison was applied differently? She turned to Margaret Whitmore, whose face had begun to pale. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, when did you first help your mother prepare the parish flowers? Margaret's voice was barely audible. Every Sunday morning? For the past 5 years, and you would have access to all the prayer books, would you not? Including Eleanor's private copy, the one she always used, the one she had donated to the church, along with the others. Yes, Margaret whispered. But you knew that Eleanor arrived early for services, Miss Marple continued gently. You knew she would settle into her pew and begin reading from her prayer book before the service commenced. Your mother had suffered tremendously from Eleanor's cruelty. She had been humiliated publicly, her business threatened, her pride destroyed. And you, Margaret, love your mother very much." Inspector Hartwell stepped forward. "Are you suggesting that Miss Whitmore poisoned Eleanor Hartley?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Margaret Whitmore's hands are quite capable of delicate work. Her mother runs a bakery. After all, Margaret has spent her life handling pastries and decorative elements that require precision. She would be able to work with small quantities of poison without difficulty, but I didn't." Margaret cried out. "Miss Marple, I swear to you no," Miss Marple said, "you didn't. But Reverend Blackwell did." The words fell like thunder in the quiet church. The Reverend's face went ashen. Inspector Hartwell's hand moved toward his pocket, as if reaching for his notebook, though he seemed uncertain whether to write or to restrain the vicar. "Edmund," Miss Marple said softly, turning to face him directly, "when you told me about the parish account discrepancies, you said that Eleanor had discovered them and was threatening to expose you. But that wasn't entirely true, was it? Eleanor had discovered that someone had stolen parish funds, but she didn't know who. She had only suspicions." The Reverend made no response, but his hands had begun to shake visibly. "However," Miss Marple continued, "you needed to determine whether she suspected you specifically, and so you created a test. You arranged for the pharmacology book to be planted in Thomas Hartley's rooms, a book you had acquired months earlier through a London supplier, the same supplier from whom you had ordered a small quantity of You had the knowledge to do this. You have a university education and access to medical texts through your correspondence with various theological colleagues. This is absurd," the Reverend said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "You positioned Thomas near the prayer books on the morning of the service, knowing that if Eleanor died and suspicion fell on him, the investigation would conclude quickly without ever touching upon the real motive, the missing parish funds. You knew that Thomas's inheritance would make him an obvious suspect, and that the police would be satisfied with the evidence you provided. You have no proof," the Reverend said, "don't I?" Miss Marple walked to the prayer book rack and withdrew a worn copy, opening it carefully. "Tell me, Inspector, when you examined Eleanor's prayer book after her death, did you check the pages themselves? The interior pages, not merely the binding and edges?" She turned to a page near the middle of the book and pointed to a subtle discoloration, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. "Strychnine, when dissolved in a small quantity of liquid and applied to paper, leaves a residue that, while largely invisible to the naked eye, can be detected under careful examination. Eleanor would have absorbed the poison not merely through her hands, but through the delicate tissues of her mouth and lips as she turned the pages. The concentration of poison on the interior pages would have been sufficient to produce rapid and fatal effects." Inspector Hartwell leaned forward, studying the page with new understanding. "And the London parcel," Miss Marple continued. "You arranged for a parcel bearing your supplier's markings to be delivered to Thomas's residence. You knew he would be questioned about it, and you had already ensured that the pharmacology book would be discovered in his rooms. You created a convincing narrative of premeditation and planning. But why?" the Reverend asked, and for the first time, genuine anguish entered his voice. "Why would I do such a thing?" "Because," Miss Marple said, her eyes reflecting deep compassion, "Eleanor had become a threat not merely to yourself, but to your entire parish. She was a woman who took pleasure in causing suffering. She blackmailed people, humiliated the vulnerable, and manipulated those around her for her own amusement. You saw the damage she was causing to Mrs. Whitmore, to Charles Hartley, to young William Vane, and you believed that her death would be a mercy, not merely for yourself, but for Thornfield as a whole. You killed a woman, Inspector Hartwell said, his voice hard with professional duty. And you attempted to frame an innocent young man. I know, the Reverend said quietly, and I have regretted it every moment since. But when I learned that Eleanor intended to expose me, I thought of Michael, of the disgrace that would befall him, of the parish losing its vicar. I thought of all the people Eleanor had harmed, and I convinced myself that her death would be justified. I was wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. And Patricia Vane? Miss Marple asked gently. The Reverend's silence was answer enough. You realized, Miss Marple continued, that she had seen you that morning near the church. You had offered her friendship and sympathy regarding her son's difficulties, and she had been grateful for the attention. When she began to understand the implications of your presence in Thornfield on the morning of Eleanor's death, you knew she would eventually come forward. So you visited her under the pretense of continuing your conversation, and you ensured that her medication bottle contained a lethal dose. You made her death appear suicidal, a mother's despair at her son's apparent guilt. Inspector Hartwell moved forward, his hand extended. Edmund Blackwell, I am placing you under arrest for the murders of Eleanor Hartley and Patricia Vane. The Reverend made no resistance as the handcuffs were applied. He looked broken, aged by decades in the space of a few moments, as he was led from the church. Miss Marple closed her eyes and whispered a prayer knot for the vicar's soul. But for Thornfield itself, and the damage that evil, even when motivated by seemingly noble intentions, could inflict upon a community. Chapter 10. The Return to Silence, 2 weeks after Reverend Edmund Blackwell's arrest. Thornfield had begun the slow, tentative process of returning to normalcy. The village, having been shaken to its foundations by the discovery that its spiritual leader was a murderer, had gradually accepted the uncomfortable truth and moved toward reconstruction. A temporary vicar arrived from the neighboring parish, a younger man named Reverend Thomas Wheeler, who preached sermons on forgiveness and redemption with a gentle awareness that his congregation needed both. Thomas Hartley had been released immediately upon the Reverend's confession, his name fully exonerated by Inspector Hartwell's official statement. The young man had left Thornfield within days, unable to bear the continued weight of association with the scandal, though his departure carried none of the shame that would have attached to a conviction. He had written a brief letter of thanks to Miss Marple, which she had received with her characteristic quiet grace. Life in the village settled into new rhythms, though the old rhythms were forever altered. The church attendance remained steady, but the parishioners who sat in their familiar pews did so with a different understanding of their community. Thornfield was no longer a place where nothing of consequence happened. It was a place where consequence had erupted from beneath the surface of apparent respectability, revealing depths that most preferred not to examine too closely. Miss Marple noticed these changes with the observant eye that had served her so well throughout the affair. She noticed that Margaret Whitmore, released from the burden of her mother's suffering, had begun to smile again. She noticed that Mrs. Sarah Whitmore had taken a small loan from the parish fund approved by the new vicar without hesitation, and that the bakery's fortunes had begun to improve. She noticed that Charles Hartley had made a substantial donation to the parish and had begun attending services with the regularity of a man seeking redemption for his own cowardice, and she noticed that William Vane had not returned to London. His letter had come to his mother's solicitor, explaining that he had decided to remain in England and pursue a new career entirely, away from medicine, away from the shadows that scandal had cast upon his profession. His mother's death had broken something in him, but it had also liberated him from the need to restore a reputation that could never be fully restored. It was on a quiet afternoon in November, 3 weeks after the Reverend's arrest, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Hartwell arrived at Daisy Cottage with the bearing of a man who had come to make amends for past dismissiveness. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting the offered tea with visible gratitude, "I have come to apologize. You were correct about the investigation from the beginning. My methods were inadequate, my conclusions premature, and my dismissal of your concerns was professional arrogance of the highest order." "You were a busy man with an apparent case," Miss Marple replied kindly. Thomas Hartley provided convenient evidence. It is not uncommon for investigators to settle upon the obvious solution when it presents itself so clearly. The Reverend was quite skilled at providing you with exactly what you expected to find. Nevertheless, Inspector Hartwell continued, "Your observations regarding Mrs. Vane's death, the details of the poison's application, the psychological understanding of the Reverend's motivations, all of this exceeded my own investigative capacity. I wonder if you have ever considered a more formal role in detective work." Miss Marple smiled, a faint expression that suggested both amusement and gentle refusal. "I am far too old to begin a new career, Inspector. And besides, I have found that my observations of village life serve me better when they remain entirely informal. The moment one becomes official, one loses the freedom to observe without judgment, to listen without agenda." After the inspector had departed, Miss Marple sat in her parlour as the November light faded into grey evening. She thought of Reverend Blackwell, now imprisoned in the county jail, awaiting trial for 2 counts of murder. She thought of his genuine anguish when confronted with the consequences of his actions. She thought of Eleanor Hartley, a woman whose cruelty had been as methodical as it was casual, poisoning the community through blackmail and humiliation. And she thought of the question that had occupied her mind since the moment of revelation. What moral accounting could possibly balance such actions? Eleanor had caused genuine harm through deliberate malice. The Reverend had committed murder, yet his motivations, while ultimately unjustifiable, had contained a strange admixture of mercy and desperation. Patricia Vane had died protecting her son from exposure. Thomas Hartley had nearly hanged for a crime he did not commit. There were no easy answers in Thornfield, Miss Marple reflected. There were only the messy realities of human nature, the capacity for both cruelty and kindness, the ability to rationalize almost anything when one's loved ones were threatened, the ease with which good intentions could transform into catastrophic actions. She rose and walked to her bookshelf, where she kept her leather-bound volume of biblical passages. She opened it to the Gospel of John and read the familiar passage, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." The words seemed particularly apt, though Eleanor Hartley had been neither. Without sin, nor the innocent victims such passages typically invoked. The village had been spared. Eleanor's further that was the strange mercy of her death, that it had prevented future harm, even as it had caused present tragedy. But the cost of that prevention had been too high, and an innocent young man had nearly paid with his freedom, perhaps his life. Miss Marple closed the book and returned to her chair. Outside, the November wind rattled the bare branches of the trees, and the village of Thornfield settled into the darkness of late autumn. Lights appeared in cottage windows, ordinary people engaged in ordinary activities, unaware of the profound damage that had been inflicted upon their community, or perhaps aware but choosing not to examine it too closely, She thought of all the small villages she had known throughout her long life. Each one contained the same mixture of virtue and vice, kindness and cruelty, honesty and deception. Each one seemed peaceful on the surface, while harboring depths that would shock the casual observer. And in each village, there were people like Eleanor Hartley, predators who fed upon the vulnerabilities of others, and people like Reverend Blackwell, who convinced themselves that evil could be justified by noble intentions. The truly dangerous moments, Miss Marple reflected, came not when evil announced itself obviously, but when it whispered, when it rationalized, when it wore the face of a respected community leader and convinced itself that murder was mercy. She would not share these thoughts with anyone. That was not her way. Instead, she would continue her quiet observations, her careful attention to the small details that revealed character, her patient understanding of human nature in all its complexity. And if she was called upon again to unveil hidden truths, she would do so not with triumph, but with the sorrow of someone who understood that truth, once revealed, could never be unknown. The case of Eleanor Hartley's murder was concluded. Justice, of a sort, had been served. But in Thornfield, as in all communities touched by violence, a permanent shadow remained, a reminder that evil could flourish in the most unlikely places, and that the price of silence, of overlooking cruelty, of dismissing the suffering of others, was ultimately paid in blood. Miss Marple knitted her needlework, the familiar motions comforting in their ordinary, and waited for tomorrow to bring whatever secrets it might contain.